What I want to do today, and again, if we need to call back, is I want to look at number 3 of the 4 features of the modern self. We've done a couple of these already, and again, just to remind us, as we understand the times, knowing what we ought to do. And so as we go into the modern self, we've had a couple that we've already done. These are the first 2. The first was expressive individualism. This is the idea that you need to express outwardly what one feels inwardly. And related to that is the idea of an inward sense of psychological well-being, that how am I truly happy or how am I truly fulfilled is how I feel on the inside. And the only way I can feel truly fulfilled and have psychological well-being is for my inner self to match my outer self. And if you can't allow me to do that, then I am not happy, I'm not fulfilled, I'm not living my true authentic self. And so we have the cult of authenticity. I need to be my authentic me, which is why we have those odd confessions, where people say, well, I was married for 25 years, but I just wasn't being true to myself, so I got divorced. I mean, that seems odd to most of us that grew up in the church or at least are in a Christian worldview, but in the culture as a whole, it's very common. And unfortunately, there are some Christians that even say stuff like that. Well, I loved him, but I wasn't really in love with him. So, you'll hear that sort of verbiage, and that's where it comes from, is this idea of I need to live my authentic self rather than pushing through it or saying I've made these commitments or I have these responsibilities that are outward focused. It's all about being true to myself. And we looked at a bunch of quotes from the transgender weightlifter from New Zealand, for example, or Congresswoman Cori Bush talking about birthing people and those sort of phrases. And it shows how this sort of mindset has impacted the culture. So these are the first 2 things we talked about when it comes to the modern self: expressive individualism, and then that inward sense of psychological well-being. Those are the first 2. The next one we need to get to now is something that's called the immanent frame. The immanent frame comes from Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher who wrote a book in 2007 or 2008 called The Secular Age. And The Secular Age is a huge influence on Carl Trueman's Modern Self book. He quotes Taylor all the time. So this is one of his big influences. And this book, The Secular Age, it is not easy reading. But there's a really interesting quote from The Secular Age that kind of encapsulates what's coming on next. So let's go with those first 2 again. Let me go back to the other screen. Forgive me. We'll come back to this. So let's say now that in order for me to be my true authentic self, I have to express what I feel inwardly, outwardly. And the only way to have a sense of psychological well-being is to be able to be that authentic me. And things that keep me down, whether it's civilization or society or whatever it is, that keeps me from being my true authentic self need to be removed or expunged or modified in order to be myself. Well, how do you justify that? What gives you a ground in order to do that? It's one thing to say, I want this, but it's a totally another thing to say, I need to justify my behaviors, right? So how do I justify living my authentic me and saying that I'm this authentic self? Well, this is where we get to the immanent frame, and we're going to end up with Karl Marx in just a second. But here's a quote from Charles Taylor on this immanent frame. And so we have come to understand our lives as taking place within a self-sufficient immanent order, or better, a constellation of orders, cosmic, social, and moral. These orders are understood as impersonal. This understanding of our predicament has a background, a sense of our history. We have advanced to this grasp of our predicament through earlier, more primitive stages of society and self-understanding. In this process, we have come of age. The immanent order can thus slough off, the transcendent, but it doesn't necessarily do so. What I've been describing as the immanent frame is common to all of us in the modern West, or at least that is what I'm trying to portray. Some of us want to live as it is open to something beyond. Some live as it is closed. It is something which permits closure without demanding it. So this is really wordy, but the word immanent is often used in contrast to the word transcendence. So something that's transcendent is beyond us or beyond the space-time continuum, beyond the universe. Immanence means everything is nearby or everything is experienced in nature or next to us or in a closed system. And you see him at the end. Some want to say that, well, maybe there's something open. That's kind of the agnostic position. And others live that it's actually closed. Marx is somebody who lives like it's closed. And you'll see that. I'm going to give you some definitions. You have a handout for the video. And I also left the back blank in case you want to take notes on this. And I'll try to remember. And I haven't done this yet, so forgive me. I've been kind of crazy with teaching 7 preps this year. I have 7 preps. which means I have 7 different classes. So every once in a while, something gets forgotten, or on my list of checklists, something doesn't get up on the priority list. And posting these PowerPoints has been something I have not been able to put up yet. So I need to remember to do that. So here's a few words. So how do we get to this immanent frame? I'm going to give you a couple of philosophical terms that help explain where Karl Marx is going to come from. So I'm going to give you a little history, and then we're going to watch the video with Truman and kind of comment on this. Karl Marx is going to come back. So we're going to look at classical Marxism for the most part, except at the very end. But what this allows is justification for your beliefs. Because if all that exists is around you, you're not accountable to anybody but yourself. That's the main reason that this is important for us. So the first one I want to give you is the idea of naturalism. This comes out of the Enlightenment of the 1700s, that all you can know, that everything arises, has natural properties and causes. You have a natural explanation for everything. So how did the universe get here? Well, we have a natural explanation. How did we become civilized? We have a natural explanation. Why do cats have variety? We have a natural explanation. Why are there all these different species in the world? Well, we have a natural explanation. And so Darwin explains biology, psychologists explain the inner workings of the human mind, historians explain history, all through natural causes. There's no God allowed in these explanations. It must have a naturalistic explanation. This comes out of the Enlightenment. It's still around, although it's not as popular as it was, say, about 20, 30 years ago. But it's still around because it gives you a philosophical grounding in order to justify other beliefs. So here's how this works. Let's say you've noticed that there are almost 2 billion Christians in the world. You can't go with the argument that it's because God exists or because Christianity could be true. You have to explain naturalistically why they're Christians. Well, it's because of their culture. It's a social construct. It's because they have a psychological need for meaning and transcendence. That's why people are Christians. And certain demographics, people that are poor or people that have childhood trauma, they're naturally lending themselves to believers because they need that sense of hope and belonging. It can't be that it's true. You have to explain it away psychologically. Does this make sense? That's naturalism at work. It's not just about things like the theory of evolution. It's also the inner workings of the human mind. You must have an explanation. So things like morality. Well, it's moral because human beings have decided that that's moral for our group survival. Not that it's moral for everybody everywhere, but that it's kind of pragmatic. It's true for us because it works for us. It's a very pragmatic view of morality. If you know American figures, American philosophy, John Stuart Mill, if you know that name. He also worked with John Dewey, if you know the Dewey Decimal System. Think that era of American history. Utilitarianism. What's true is what works for the most amount of people. Very naturalistic. It's not that it's true because it's true. It's true because it's pragmatically true, and so we just adapt to it. So naturalism is a huge deal. And at the bottom, you can see this. This is why we use the words phobia when you disagree with certain lifestyles and behaviors, because you're psychologically explaining it away. It can't be that they have a disagreement. There's got to be something wrong with them in their brains that's making them oppose it. So if you disagree, for example, that transgender people should be able to have gender-confirming surgeries and that they should be able to choose whatever bathroom they want and go on and on, go on the whole list. If you disagree, it's because you are transphobic. See why? Because there's something psychological. It can't be that you have a moral argument or that you have a worldview argument. It has to be there's something wrong with you psychologically. See the naturalistic explanation? It's something in your brain. You have an irrational fear that you have to kind of explain away, okay? Or you are homophobic, or if you oppose open borders, you are xenophobic, or see all the phobias? So you add all these phobias because it means we can explain away your opposition by psychoanalyzing you and saying you have some sort of psychosis or some sort of fear or something going on in your brain that's stopping you from agreeing with what we obviously think is true, which is, again, maximalizing the modern self.
Can I just say I can't even keep up with all the phobias anymore?
Yeah, it's amazing the proliferation of not only phobias, but the amount of groups that are supposedly oppressed, right? I mean, it's just a proliferation. So there's the amount of phobias that exist match the amount of oppressed groups that there are. Okay, so yes, you can't keep track. The most common that you'll hear is homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. There's 2, 3, or 4 others that you'll kind of hear. And I know Tara in the psychology department, I'm sure you get this all the time. We talk about these phobias, okay? So anyways, this is, again, it comes from this angle, though. It's from the philosophy of naturalism. Because if there's nothing else that that's the immanent frame, you're not accountable to anything else, and you want to maximize your personal happiness, then that you got to get rid of the people that are stopping you from doing that. And the way to do that naturalistically is to say they have some sort of psychological issue. There's something wrong with them naturalistically. Can't be that, for example, things like sin exist. You can't have sin because sin is some sort of spiritual thing. That's not naturalistic. Sin is not, original sin is very unpopular. Okay? Pastor Dinger talks about sin today. If you were in church this morning, he did a really good job, especially in the first half, that I don't want this to be true, but it's true. It's real. We're realistic about the human condition. And so that's an old G.K. Chesterton on that. And I quoted him a couple weeks ago. But this is naturalism. Marx is a naturalist. Okay, you need to know that about Marx, is he's a naturalist. Marx is a naturalist. He is also, this is my next one, an empiricist. So again, forgive me for these terms, it's a little heady, but it helps you understand where Marx is coming from. And it also helps explain a lot of our kind of social science departments in the academy, and really what many in the, like what I call the secular or mainstream media assume about the world. So here's the next one, it's empiricism. So it's the theory that the origin of all knowledge is based on sense experience. You have to observe it or taste it, use the five senses, use the scientific method, confirm it, send it, create a control group, have somebody at a different university, maybe across the sea, do the exact same experiment and repeat it. And then if you can come to a consensus, that's how you get to knowledge. So knowledge is only available in this philosophy through empirical observation. And so you can see how it and naturalism, while not exactly the same thing, kind of help each other out. So if you're going to do things empirically, you have to use the natural world. And if you believe the natural world is all that exists, the only thing you can know about the natural world is through empirical observation. So they're not exactly the same thing, but they're often they often coincide. So you're really militant, say, and now I'm going to go to creation evolution sort of stuff. You're really militant atheistic evolutionists are almost always both of these things. They're almost always naturalistic and empiricists. Unless you can measure it and taste it and touch it and test it and repeat it, it's not science, number one, and number two, it's not real knowledge. So in other words, something like the existence of God who's transcendent, because I can't scientifically test that hypothesis, it's therefore not true, or it's impossible to know if it's true. You see what I mean? So you're limiting yourself to these sort of things. Now, this could be a method. If you just say this is one way of knowing, not the only way of knowing, but one way of knowing, sure, I agree that the scientific method works sometimes, or works a lot of times when you're observing the natural world. I agree that when you can test something and work your hypothesis, all those elementary, middle school things we learned about the scientific method, sure, I think those things exist. The issue is, why does it exist? And then secondly, is that the only way you can know things? If you say yes, then you're an empiricist or a naturalist, probably both of those. Usually they're in combination. So again, the immanent frame, because the only thing that exists is nature, and the only thing you can know about anything has to be testable, repeatable, measured empirically by the five senses and deduced from that. Marx is both of these. He is a materialist. We'll get to materialism in a second. He is an empiricist and he's a naturalist. This is going to matter because when he tries to explain what's wrong with humanity, his explanation has to be empirical, naturalistic. See what I mean? It can't be sin. It can't be a spiritual problem. It can't be an emotional problem that can't be measured. It's got to be measured somehow. So this is why he's obsessed with economics, because you can measure that. Okay? All right, the last one is materialism. This one's kind of like all of them, but again, it's just another philosophical term. Marx is technically, if you want to go into philosophy, forgive me, a dialectical materialist. You don't need to know that term. Doesn't really help you to know that term, but it's what he is. Because he follows a guy named Hegel, but you'll listen to this later with Truman. The important thing for me in this kind of introduction here, in philosophy, it's the view that all facts, including the mind and human history, are dependent on physical processes or reducible to them. So this means that the reason you feel love for your wife is just simply chemical responses that are going off in your head. It's materials. See what I mean? The reason you want to protect your kids is it's a hormonal survival instinct that we've evolved over thousands and thousands and millions of years. And so that strong bond that you feel with your kids, that's just because you're a higher mammal. Other higher mammals have that bond, and we can reduce that to hormones and psychological responses that exist in the material world. So you may think that you call that love, but really, what it really is those endorphins that you released when you had your kid, when you gave birth, and all those other different things. All that kind of combines, and you attach yourself hormonally and emotionally to your child, but it's only that. That's all that exists. You call it love. You think it's something spiritual or greater than love, but it's really just a bunch of chemicals and hormones. You following? This comes out of the Enlightenment, and so Marx is a materialist. So that means ethics, social problems, history itself, you have to look at it through only physical processes. You can only look at it through nature. You can only look at it through a frame of reference, the immanent frame. And so we don't walk around, even Christians do this. God becomes weightless, even if you believe in God. You may say that God exists. You may say that Jesus died for your sins, but Monday through Saturday, when you're not in church, you live as if he's not immanent. I mean, that he's not immanent. You only have this immanent frame. So in other words, you're a Christian on Sunday, but throughout the week, you just assume some of the same stuff your culture does. Yeah, God exists, and maybe he's going to come back someday, but I'm going to live as if he doesn't. Okay, so we are impacted by the immanent frame in many ways. Okay, God is weightless, even for Christians sometimes. And if he doesn't exist in this worldview, or you can't prove that he exists, then that's about the definition of weightlessness. Think about what this does for justification of belief. So now, if all that exists is material things, then the reason I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body, the reason that makes sense is there's something wrong with my hormones, or there's something wrong with my psychological state, so that my gender and sex don't quite coincide. And so this gender dysphoria, in order for me to be truly happy, I need to somehow make them match, because that's all there is, just the material world. And this is my material body. And for me to have psychological well-being, we need to use science or psychology or operations or pills or whatever, so that I can line those things up. See why these relate to each other? Is this kind of making sense? So these are all interlocking threads in the modern self. Okay, so just again, Marx is all three of these, just to kind of keep those up there. If you're keeping notes, Marx is a naturalist, an empiricist, and a materialist. He's all those three things. I mean, he is all in on his atheism. He is unapologetic about wanting to destroy religion. He wants to destroy it so that the revolution can happen. Okay, that's why you talk about things like class consciousness, and you hear those terms that you get out of like Marxism. It's because, and that's why religion, it's not just religion. Capitalism is another one, but there's a whole series of things he wants to destroy so that people are aware of their condition, so that they can rise up and go to the next layer of history. Okay, so Marx, it matters for the modern self. I'm going to show you Truman now. Truman's going to show you how Marx looks at things and how he looks at religion. And that's where the front side of that handout I gave you will come back in. Okay, so now we're going to go through blanks. So let's go to Truman here. Before I go to this, any questions on this? This is going to come back again, because how he looks at classes and how he looks at conditions and solutions is going to be extended not just to economics, but to really all facets of life. And that's what people mean when they use the word cultural Marxism. That's what they mean. So it's not just economic oppression, it's social oppression and racial oppression and gender oppression and patriarchal oppression and colonial oppression. And the whole list of oppressors gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's viewed through this lens, but it's not classical Marxism anymore. It's postmodern Marxism. And that's where we're going to get critical theories. Because critical theories are basically postmodern Marxism. We're going to answer that. Yeah, so cultural, yeah, so this is what I'm describing to you, and what you're going to hear from Truman is what's sometimes called classical Marxism. Classical Marxism is mostly based in economics. And so because remember, he's a materialist, right? And so since he's a materialist, what Marx believes, and you're going to get this with Truman, the video is going to help a little bit. But when you get to Truman, what Truman will say is that Marx looked at the condition of humanity. And remember, he's writing in the Industrial Revolution. So when you look in the Industrial Revolution and you see, those kind of heartbreaking pictures of kids covered in coal soot, right? And they're working at like 6 years old, child labor, or you see workers that died because of the conditions in the mines or in the factories, and you see the blackening of the cities and all those sort of things. Marx looked at the condition of those workers and said, we have a problem, okay? And to him, the problem was not that you had you had owners who were not looking at their fellow human beings and that they were sinning, right? Instead, it was, we have a ruling capitalist class who's exploiting labor and own all the means of production. And so what we need for utopia is for this capital class to be overturned so that all workers can share in the fruits of their labor. Does that make sense? So classical Marxism has to do with economics for the most part. Economics, capital, money, ownership of factories, ownership of goods, sharing. That's where eventually he writes the Communist Manifesto. The idea, the thing that always is tried and always fails, and then people say, well, that wasn't real communism. Okay, every time. But that's the idea. We all share, communal. It's related to the word communal. We all share in the means of production. We all hold in common ownership of everything. Okay, so that's very economic. Does that make sense? So that's classical Marxism. Cultural Marxism is the idea that instead of it just being economics, the reason the revolution didn't happen is there's these other cultural barriers that stop and keep people in charge. So it's not just enough to say there's economic oppression. There's also oppression by the patriarchy, for example. Men want to keep women down. And so cultural Marxism in this case can be allied with radical feminism, because that's going to overturn the hegemon, the rulers that are going to exploit everybody else, right? The leader of the hegemon or the ruling class, instead of just capitalists, not only are they capitalists, but they're male, they're white. Oh, and here's another one. They are heterosexual. They are able-bodied. They are native-born. You see how this, it's going to keep growing and growing. See how this works? And the goal is if you're not those things, you're at war with those things. That's cultural Marxism. Sound familiar? This is where critical theory is going to come in, because intersectionality is each one of those things that you are not. Okay, so if you're a black man, but you're straight, native born, able-bodied, you got one thing that's a one intersection of oppression. But if you're a black gay man who's disabled, now you have three intersections of oppression. See how this is going to work? That's where that term comes from. That's cultural Marxism in action, right there. So it's not just the capitalist, it's the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, native-born. See what I mean? Now, and it might change depending on your culture. So in Saudi Arabia, it's usually Christian also, or Judeo-Christian, okay? In Saudi Arabia, it would be Arab, male, heterosexual, Muslim, rich. You see what I'm saying? That's the man in Saudi Arabia. But in America, it's white, cisgendered, native-born. See what I mean? So depending on where you live, it might change. That's where it's very postmodern. It's not true everywhere. It's true based on your cultural conditioning. Okay? That's cultural Marxism. That is different than classical Marxism, which is almost exclusively concerned with economics. Okay? So this is why, for the modern self, we're going to focus on this one. When we get to critical theories later, it's going to come back. You're seeing why. So critical feminist theory, critical queer theory, critical gender studies, critical race theory, all of these are all part of a thing called critical theories, and they're based out of this worldview, which is this idea that you have an oppressive class, and the goal is that we look at society and we you'll get this word. This is a verb in studies now. We problematize. We need to problematize things. So, well, the reason we have laws against, for example, loitering, right? You can't just stand at somebody's business, like city laws against loitering. Well, that's because of systemic racial oppression. They just didn't like black people. That's why we have those loitering laws. So we need to get rid of all the loitering laws because those are problematized now. Okay? Police themselves in some circles. The reason we even have police is try to keep people down. So we need to defund the police. See? So there's a logic behind this. You just got to understand the worldview, okay? So you're getting a little, sorry, squirrel moment. Anna asked a great question, but do you see the difference between classical and cultural Marxism, though? That's what we mean. And cultural Marxism is sometimes a poison word because it's true that the Nazis called something cultural Bolshevism, and that was in World War II, and that was because they were, Nazis were afraid of communists. And so when you say cultural Marxism, they'll say, well, that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. No. It's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The language is used in the literature. You can do a Google Scholar search and search cultural Marxism, and people they'll advocate for it. Okay, it's not like I'm making it up, or it's not some conspiracy theory. They're very honest and open about it, which I guess is a good thing with the internet. There's positives and negatives. You can kind of prove it with that. All right, so let's go to Truman now that Anna's kind of asked her question and gotten me going on that one. We'll do this now. But it's a great question. I appreciate it. No, it's a good. So now you know that's a preview. Now you know we're going to talk about the critical theories. Okay, so when we get to critical theories, we're going to get into all this and look at all these different disciplines and why people say the things they say when it comes to those. So here's Truman on the Makers of the Modern Mind. Now this is Marx. If you'll hit play, there we go.
The the last lecture, I looked at the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the impact of his writings and the inspiration they were for the movement which later scholars refer to as Romanticism within the artistic and cultural world. But I ended by asking the question that what happens if the assumption of Rousseau, and in many ways the assumption of the Romantics, this idea that nature itself has some kind of meaning, what happens if that disappears? What happens if all there is really is this world that has no meaning intrinsic to itself? And that's really the situation we get to in the 19th century. And I want to spend this class, this lecture and the next lecture, looking at the thought of two particular individuals who wrestled with that idea. First is Karl Marx, German philosopher and revolutionary political thinker, and the second will be Friedrich Nietzsche, also a German philosopher, and in many ways just as, if not more, revolutionary than Marx. Both men have this in common. They were wrestling at some level with an interesting problem. And the interesting problem was this: why, after the Enlightenment had effectively put the sword to traditional religion, why, after the Enlightenment had really made traditional religion culturally and intellectually implausible, was religion so persistent? Why did people continue to believe in things that Marx and Nietzsche and their elite intellectual contemporaries would have regarded as little more than fairy stories or fables? And though Marx and Nietzsche come up with different answers to that question, they both approach it in a similar way. What they did was they wrestled with the question in terms of human psychology. Mentioned a couple of times already in this short course, the significance of psychology, the way we think, the way we relate to the world from our inward being, our inner being, is very important. And Marx and Nietzsche both approached religion in terms of trying to find out what psychological function it fulfilled that meant that it persisted long after they considered it to have become intellectually incoherent and irresponsible. First, a bit of background on Karl Marx. His dates, 1818 to 1883. He's buried, as it happens, in Highgate Cemetery in the north of London. Though he was a German philosopher, he spent his later years in London researching and working in the British Library, and was buried in Highgate Cemetery. When he was buried there, Friedrich Engels, his financial supporter and co-laborer in the communist cause, made a speech where he essentially said, Marx dies today virtually unknown, but 50 years from now everybody in the world will have heard his name. Would have seemed ridiculous at the time, but of course, as we now know, Karl Marx and the movements which his writings and life inspired did become dominant features of the 20th century and transformed the world as it was. He's most famous in terms of his literary work for the Communist Manifesto and for the great work of economics, Das Kapital. He inspired communist regimes, China, Soviet Union, Cuba. But here, it's not his revolutionary politics, nor is it his economics that I wish to reflect on. I want to reflect upon his philosophy, because that takes us to the heart of what I'm trying to do in this short course. And there are two things I want to put up front about Marx's philosophy before we go into to dive into his thinking on religion. First thing to notice about Marx is he's a radical materialist. Remember that term I used in the first lecture, the immanent frame, the idea that reality can be understood purely in terms of the material world in which we live. Well, that's Marx's world. That's Marx's world in spades. For Marx, the world is immanent. There is no transcendence. More than that, the material conditions of life for Marx, specifically economic relations, shape how people think of reality. In other words, for Marx, the way you think is profoundly shaped by where you fit in to the economic structure of society at large. And that affects everything. It affects everything you do. It affects everything you believe. Think, for example, of morality. If you were to ask a Christian, why do you believe morally the things that you do? Probably the Christian would respond, well, because this is a human way of expressing the character of God. Thou shalt not kill, because God does not approve of killing. Thou shalt not commit adultery, because God is a God who is faithful to his people. There's a sacred, transcendent ground, if you like, for our morality that goes beyond this world. For Marx, no, that's not an option. For Marx, the world and everything in it has to be understood purely in terms of the world and everything in it. And that includes things like morality and moral codes. For Marx, moral codes are simply the ways by which the ruling class, those with power, keep others in their place and thereby protect and preserve their own privileged position in society. Morality, if you like, we might say, is a political tool for tricking people into behaving in the way that the rulers need them to behave in order to maintain their status as rulers. So the first thing to note about Marx is an absolute rejection of the transcendent. He is one of the great theorists, we might say, of the immanent frame. Secondly, Marx, at least the young Marx of the 1840s, was particularly interested in a concept of alienation. Alienation, what does it mean? Well, it's a sort of fancy way of saying he was interested in the concept of why, how and why men and women were somehow at odds with themselves. They somehow had that feeling of not fitting in, of not being comfortable or happy in the world in which they found themselves. We can think of simple examples of alienation, perhaps in our own experience. Maybe you remember being at school and you really wanted to be in with the in crowd, so you'd go over and you'd sit with the cool kids at lunchtime, and as you put your plate down on the dinner table, all of the cool kids get up and walk away and sit down on another table. And that makes you feel bad. At that point, you feel out of joint. You feel that you don't quite fit in the world. There's an uncomfortability that comes with that. That's a form of alienation. And Marx is interested in why is it, if you like, that people are unhappy? What is it that prevents people from realizing their full potential, from being, we might say, at one with themselves? And of course, Marx is a materialist, though. So his answer to that question has to have a material answer. And Marx's answer is essentially this: man's dissatisfaction, man's feeling of alienation in this world is related to the fact that he is alienated economically. He doesn't enjoy, for example, the fruits of his labor because he's paid, say, minimum wage, and he never sees or enjoys that which he produces. Think of the person who works on the production line, putting a screw into a computer. All they do for endless days is put a little screw into a computer. They never take the computer home and enjoy it. What they take home is the minimum wage. And that doesn't make them feel satisfied with their life. They take no satisfaction from their work. They're alienated from their work. And this is an important concept because it really does lie in the background of Marx's understanding of religion. Put it simply, and I want to explain this in a little more detail, put it simply, for Marx, religion is a false, wrong answer to a real need. It reflects...
I'll pause right there really quick, just in case you're following on the blanks, if you're kind of into it. So under number 2, letter A, so he's a radical materialist. That's why I started off the PowerPoint that I did, is because I wanted to explain what that meant. That all that exists is just the physical world, and it must have a physical, empirical, measurable observation in order to understand it. So he's trying to go to human psychology and say, why do people feel the way they do? So for us, we would say the reason we feel alienated is because we realize the world isn't like it should be. Marx would actually agree with that the world is not like it should be. We would say the reason it's not like it should be is because of original sin. The world is not like it should be because we corrupted it, because all of creation groans, as Paul says, because we're not only sinners ourselves and curved in on ourselves, we also are sinners to each other. And then governments and societies writ large are made by sinners. So of course you're going to have problems in society. Every culture is going to, okay? It reminds me of when we got married. My marriage counselor was awesome. My wife and I sat down. We weren't married yet, so we sat down at the table with him, and he's our pastor at the time. And he goes, "All right, first session," and it wasn't, how long have you known each other, or why do you think you need to get married, or no, it was, "All right, we got two sinners getting married. How's this going to go?" That was like the first session, and we were like, "Okay, no romanticism here." This is like, but it was great though. And so the very first assignment he gave us was to independently, our homework was to work on a budget without showing each other, and then bring it back to the next session. That's talking about some practical marriage advice, right? I mean, that was about as down to earth and as practical. He had lots of years of just practical experience working with couples through difficulties and stuff like that. So our marriage counseling was first, your sinners getting married. So, I know you love each other right now and you think the other is the greatest person in the world, but just wait, And that was like, literally, that's kind of like the first session. And then it was go work on a budget and see how it goes. It was amazing. But it really did help us. And it really did start our marriage in a good footing because there was reality. There was honesty there. It wasn't just running through the fields of daisies, holding each other's hands and expecting it to be, I found my one or something like that. It was, hey, you guys got to get to work now, And so, but think about that honesty, that's what Christians view as our problem. It's a sin problem. It's internal. Man is curved in on himself, not looking this way or this way, not to God or to his neighbors. And when you put that at society writ large, a democracy, everybody's voting, you have sinners voting. How's that going to go? You have sinners that are kings. How's that going to go? Economic systems are still run and populated and put into practice by sinners. How's that going to go? So Marx is actually not 100% wrong on this. He's right that human beings feel alienated. What we question is the reason for that and the solution. So often what you'll find, especially with Marxism, whether it's classical Marxism or postmodern Marxism, is they make good observations or point out real problems, but the reason that the problems exist or the solutions are worse. So is it true that, for example, going to Anna's question, for cultural Marxism, is it true that a black woman's experience in New York City is different than a black woman's experience in Texas? Yes. I think we can all kind of realize that, right? Is it true that an older disabled woman in Idaho is going to be treated a little differently than as an older disabled woman in Florida? Yes. That's not, so people have different experiences. So that's a good observation. Okay, the observation is not bad. That's where some of these intersectional terms come in. The problem is why do those things exist and how do we solve it is where we really get off. Okay, does that help you a little bit? So often the reason why some of these theories and Marxism itself, even classical Marxism, is still around, right? It still is. In Cuba and North Korea, it still exists. Okay, so classical Marxism is still around. The reason people are attracted to this is it makes legitimate observations about real problems and offers a solution, but the solution it offers is often worse, okay? Or it's false, or it's because they misunderstand why the problems are there. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So Marx is not all wrong, that many human beings do feel alienated. That's true. Why do they feel alienated? Well, he, as a materialist, says, and that's your blanks here, right? So the way you think in, number two, the way you think is profoundly shaped by where you fit in the economic structure. Are you part of the proletariat, right, the lower group, or the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeois, the upper class? Because how you fit in society matters on your economic status. And the goal is to erase class consciousness, to realize that even though that guy down the street I may not love that much, we're in the same class, and we have a common enemy, the bourgeois, the capitalist, see? So that's one of his goals when it comes to his revolutionary politics. He's not focusing on that, and rightfully so, but I'm just telling you where that comes from. Okay, letter B, the concept of alienation. I think you got that. How and why women are at odds with themselves. Why are they at odds with themselves? Now, can you see why this is going to lead to critical theories later? Because it's not just economics now. They're at odds with themselves because society says that heterosexuality is the norm. So that's why they're alienated. See, this is how Marxism is going to apply in different categories. Okay?
There's no accountability. You just blame somebody else for your problems.
Correct. It's not your fault. It's society, right? And this is where it relates to Rousseau. Remember the stuff about Rousseau? That civilization is the problem. That culture is the problem. Civilization is artificial. And we need to be my authentic me. And that's where you got like people like Henry David Thoreau living in the woods by myself to be closer to God and closer to nature, to be my authentic me. Can you see how Marx can kind of, and these streams can kind of relate to each other a little bit? That's why they're all kind of part of the same package of the modern self, because she's right. Jessica's right about that. Because it's outward focused as the problem. The solution, see, isn't this interesting? The solution is inward focused. I'm going to solve it for myself by getting rid of all this extra stuff outside of me. And so for Marx, he says, let's remake all society so that everybody can be their authentic selves, right? Or not be alienated anymore. Okay, so again, man is alienated economically in classical Marxism, in Marx's own writings, okay? And then number 3, where we kind of ended here, and I want to let this finish hopefully. For Marx, religion is a false, and you can see it up there, is a false, wrong answer to a real need. This is where we're going to get that really famous quote that religion is the opiate of the masses, or the opiate of the people. Have you ever heard that quote before? He's going to give you the full context for this, because it often means more than people think it means. So it's odd. He hates religion, but he sympathizes with religious people. Does that help maybe? He hates religion itself, but sympathizes why people are religious. You follow me on this? That's where he makes that comment. It's like a natural high people need because of their suffering. But if you take away that opiate, now they're going to realize what the real problem is. See? That's where it's going to come from. Okay?
It's the fact that man is alienated from himself and the world. And it represents an attempt, a false, futile, failing attempt to overcome that. That also, of course, will have profound political significance, because it means that if one is to achieve utopia, if one is to achieve a world where people are no longer alienated, one must achieve a world where religion, as a function, as symptom of alienation, has no place. So that's the background then. Let's now think in a little more detail about what Marx actually says about religion. Well, first of all, as I noted at the start, Marx is interested primarily in why people believe. The persistence of religion fascinates him. Marx is typical of a 19th century Enlightenment figure. He thinks that the Enlightenment and the great philosophers, Kant and company, have essentially debunked a lot of traditional religious belief. It's implausible. David Hume, for example, argued that he demonstrated the epistemological non-viability of religion, that belief in God could not be warranted. Marx assumes that. He also assumes that morality debunks Christianity as well. So, for example, the idea that there is a good God when there is so much suffering in the world seems incoherent. So, religion for Marx, he just assumes it's false and wrong. He's not in the game of proving such. That's where he starts. And as I've said already, he's a materialist. So he has no interest in the transcendent anyway. Very influenced, as it happened, by a contemporary German philosopher. Both he and Marx were, in their different ways, disciples of an earlier German philosopher, G.W.F. Hegel. This man called Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach very much influenced Marx in that he had a very strictly materialist view of reality and applied that to his critique and understanding of religion. So the second aspect of Marx's thinking on religion is the role of this man, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach wrote a great work, The Essence of Christianity, in which he attempted to explain away Christianity, its life forms and its doctrines in purely materialist terms. And he sums up religion in this way, in this work, The Essence of Christianity, and I quote, "Religion, at least the Christian religion, is the relation of man to himself, or more correctly to his own nature, i.e. his subjective nature, but a relation of it viewed as a nature apart from its own. The divine being is nothing else than the human being, or rather the human nature purified, freed from the limits of the individual man, made objective, i.e. contemplated and revered as another, a distant being. All the attributes of the divine nature are therefore attributes of the human nature." Now you might be sitting there thinking, what on earth does all that mean? That has a kind of almost a gobbledygookish kind of feel to it. Well, we can express it very, very simply. Put simply, what Feuerbach says is this: religion is man's projection of his ideal self onto a being that he has invented outside of himself and calls God.
It's actually a clever explanation. See what he's doing? He's saying we realize that we're fallen, or that we screw things up, and that we're not who we should be. You know, we could be more moral or more excellent or stronger physically, or we all have those goals, right? Whether it's losing weight or reading books or learning a language or being kinder or having more knowledge or whatever it is. And since we recognize that, we instead say, well, we're going to project those ideas and say there's a being out there that has all that we don't have, and we call that God. So man has invented God. You see where he's going with this? Materialistically, he's saying it's a psychological projection that we've invented. This is why people in the academy, in particular, sometimes view Christians as stupid, or not just Christians, Muslims, people of any religion, because they'll say, we're smart, we're enlightened, we know better. We know that God is just a projection or just a psychological response, or, you know, kind of like something you need to make yourself feel better on Sundays. It's like knitting, you know, it's kind of like it's therapy, right? That's what they think. Okay, and they're like, we don't want to take people's religion away, but it should have nothing to do with science and politics, because that actually matters on us. Okay, so we can't have religion doing no, we can't allow a divine foot in the door on that stuff. If you want to have your own little Sunday kind of club, that's fine. But we who are enlightened and smarter than you realize that it's just all a projection, and it's all just kind of a myth, because that doesn't, you see where this comes from? That's why they seem so snobbish about things, is because they think that via Marx and Feuerbach and Freud and all these other different people that come out through the 1900s, they think they've done away with this. The God hypothesis is wrong, and so therefore people who still believe are not intelligent. They're stupid. They're deluded. They're products of culture or whatever it is. Okay, so that attitude has a reason. There's a philosophical grounding for it. So they honestly believe, not all of them, but a lot of them believe, and you can just extend this out. You can create hormonal reasons or emotional reasons or cultural reasons why people are religious, but it can't be that it's true, because what we assume to be true is the materialist worldview or the naturalistic worldview. So maybe I have a better naturalistic explanation, right? Because when Feuerbach and Marx were writing in the 1800s, they didn't know about hormones and chemicals and stuff like we do, right? We know, so they were right. They just didn't know how right they were. Now we can even prove even more why. It's just endorphin responses and all these other different things. See, so this worldview has not ended. And so if this stuff is true again, think about the modern self, that means that all I am is a product of emotions and control and all these different things. So to be true to myself, I can manipulate those chemicals. I can manipulate those hormones. I can change my body, because after all, this is all the world, that's all there is, and that's all I am really at nature, is just a material being, right? See what I mean? So I mean, these things are really, really impactful. Ideas, I say this to my students over and over and over, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. What you believe, what your worldview is, matters. And so I'm going to end today. My kids are up here. They're being really good, actually. I'm impressed. They're actually behaving themselves. They have to listen to me at home anyways. They're used to it. So, all right. In church today, I want you to pay attention. Pastor Dinger makes a really interesting quote, and he quotes this on his PowerPoint. He doesn't quote this in here, but he quotes this in Judges. His first point is the bad news on sin, and he has whatever happened to sin. Like, we don't want to talk about it, right? And he's right. We don't want to talk about it. He quotes from the book of Judges. Back in August, I did a little mini session where everyone does what is right in their own eyes. That's the book of Judges. It's mentioned numerous times. For the whole world did what was right in their own eyes. This sort of philosophy allows you to do what is right in your own eyes. It provides justification. It's not just, well, I know that kind of makes me feel better. It's kind of nasty, and maybe it's not right. But if this is true, what's to stop you? See what I mean? This gives you justification in order to do these sort of things. So this is a grounding, a philosophical grounding for the modern self. And that's why we are now living in the environment in which everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Here's my biblical little thought for you, is that, and Pastor Dinger will say this if you haven't been in service yet, we are living in the era of the book of Judges, where everyone does what's right in their own eyes, then they get oppressed, then they repent, and then the whole cycle starts again. We're in that cycle. That's his contention. We're living in an era that's like the book of Judges. So do with that what you will. I recommend reading that. The whole last 3 or 4 chapters is pretty nasty, to be honest, where the context of that comes out of. It is not exactly Sunday school reading. I would not read it to my kids. Just warning you. Last 3 or 4 chapters of Judges. I see you.
Watch when I sit.
Yeah, you're sinking. You're not quite big enough yet. All right, let's see. They're good. He knows we're ending now. All right, say the blessing. May the Lord bless us and keep us. May the Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen.